Dr. Doug Rao and myself, Dr. Nikki Cooley, would like to welcome you to Lecture 2 on the evolution of food production. This lecture is the second lecture of the subject Food Production in a Changing World, which is a component of the Bachelor of Agriculture and Technology. This degree is offered at both North Melbourne Institute of TAFE and Melbourne Polytechnic. Please visit our website for further information about this subject and the other courses that we offer at www.nmit.edu.au. In this lecture today we are going to review the history of human food production. We will look at the evolution from a time perspective. We will understand the food history and how it has evolved, and this will enable us to identify what has influenced food production in the past. Food production systems have undergone significant changes since mankind started to farm, and in this lecture we will learn about some of these changes. The aim of this lecture and its associated reading will enable students to describe and explain the historical evolution of human food production, as well as some of the key factors driving food change in these production systems. It has been stated that the history of the world is the history of humanity. I like the image on the screen because it represents mankind's development and gives you a snapshot at how man has evolved and humanity has evolved over time. When studying the history of farming, it is perhaps necessary to review the history of humanity. So if we're going to understand the history of food production, and therefore learn about the history of humanity, we need a historical classification. And in history, our classification is often defined along the terms of time. Changes to historical classification, however, can be complex, and they will depend on when you were taught the history and where you were taught it. Different areas across the globe have different terminologies for certain stages in history, and it is important when you are undergoing some of your research for this subject that you understand these differences. So, if we are going to follow with the history of humanity, we usually start with the prehistory called the Apolithic or Early Stone Age. This is also referred to as the Old or Paleolithic Stone Age. This is followed by the Middle Stone Age or Mesolithic, which is then framed with the Neolithic or New Stone Age. So there are in fact 3 eras in the Stone Age. During early human development, mankind was known as nomadic. That meant he moved from area to area and tended to hunt and gather his food. The New Stone Age was defined in part by moving to what we know as the Agricultural Revolution, which occurred between 8000 and 5000 BCE. The Agricultural Revolution was the start of farming, and this is where animals and plants were used by humanity. This advancement had significant changes in humanity. Settled lifestyles lead to farmers living in permanent settlements. Nomadism, the word that describes a nomadic lifestyle, continued in some locations, especially if that location was an isolated region where it was difficult to domesticate the plant species. It was, however, the relative security that farming offered, along with the increased productivity, that allowed human communities to expand into increasingly larger units, which were aided by new inventions in transportation. There are other ways that you can define historical classification. Sometimes your research may give you reference from a religious perspective, as there is a lot of early literature on religion and food. Historical classification can also be seen or described from a country-specific description. The following figure illustrates how some terminology can differ depending on what region of the world you are learning your history in. You can use this figure as a reference for your research. So this image, in part, reviews our early understanding of humanity development. We started off as hunter-gatherers, and then came along the agricultural revolution. This was followed by other innovations that made significant changes to humanity, which also include the ability to make metal and to work it, irrigation and ploughing, the evolution of significant advances in religion, and the industry era and the evolution around these technologies. This graph also shows another important driver of changes in food production across humanity, and that is the change in human population. As you can see, the change in recorded human population is quite steady but low up until about 2000. However, after this time, and particularly recently, human population has increased significantly. I would like you to look at the following web link, www.foodtimeline.org. This resource was put together by Lynn Olver in 1999. If you refer to this link, what you will see is a list of food and substances and associated references that are tracked over time. This is an exceptionally useful and interesting resource. In this resource you will be able to align time that a food resource was first used and how that food was integrated in some resources, i.e. recipes. The first resources you will note used by humanity were that of water, ice and salt. Some fish resources, such as oysters, scallops, mussels, were introduced before 17,000 BC. For example, you can see that the first recorded recipes occur at about 10,000 BC, and these were flour, bread and soup. From about 17,000 BC, there was a gradual increase in humanity's use of global food resources, such as the introduction of almonds, American bison, and the introduction of wine and beer, pigs, goats and sheep, and all of this occurred in about 7,000 BC. The introduction of yeast was another important adaptation for being able to manipulate grains so that other products such as bread could be made. This had occurred around 4000 BC. Another significant advancement was the introduction of ice cream, or at least it was significant for me, and this occurred in 3000 BC. The introduction of ice cream, of course, came from being able to produce milk, and then such products as yogurt and sour cream. One addition that I find particularly strange is that we were making wine long before we were eating grapes in about 4000 BC. Chicken, you will note, was one of the first animals in humanity to be domesticated, and this occurred in about 3200 BC. For those of you attached to your coffee, you will note that this was first produced in the 9th century. It is in the early development of humanity where foods are first introduced, such as vegetables, fruit, and some meat products. However, it is worth noting that from about the 13th century, the complexity of what you can do with these foods increases significantly. The processing of these foods usually is undertaken via recipes. It is also associated with the sophistication of being able to store foods. That is, we can store them in more complex ways. These advancements increase and continue, and is recorded to modern times. Innovations such as the freezer would have assisted in the contribution. The 19th century has recorded a significant increase in food introduction and complexity, with key dates such as milk solid production by the gallon, and this was first introduced in 1939. The introduction of frozen foods was in 1924. The introduction of gourmet magazine food ads may not seem like a significant advancement in 1946, but it does. It changes our attitudes, or reflects our attitudes of change towards food. The introduction of TV dinners in 1953 also symbolises both advances in food storage technologies and changes to lifestyle and our perceptions about food. The use of such compounds such as high fructose corn syrup in 1967 is also another significant advancement in food processing and what we can and do with food substances. The introduction of genetically modified foods occurred in 1977. This is another advancement in both technology and our attitudes towards food. It is believed that the first commercial production of genetic food was tea and was delivered by the Jewel Tea Company of Chicago. Finally, perhaps the most up-to-date change in food composition is the introduction of what is called the test tube burgers in 2013, a product I have not been able to try. Again, this symbolises both a significant advancement in technology and knowledge, but also potentially a change in consumer attitudes and the things that we eat. The food timeline documents allows an overview in food availability and incidences of change. This change was enabled largely by humans and how they farmed. In the next section of the lecture, we are going to present some examples of changes to farming throughout humanity. This topic is far too large to cover every single transition and stage. However, I have selected some interesting scenarios that do underpin productivity drivers. We are going to look in some detail and begin with the transition of the nomadic lifestyle to early agriculture. We will then look at the Bronze Age in the 4th and 5th millennium. This brings us to the 3rd century, where we will have an overview of the 3rd century and then look specifically at farming in China during this region. We will look at a case study of farming in Athens, which travels from the 7th to the 4th century. And then we will jump to the 19th and 20th centuries. So now let's explore in more detail some of the early developments of agriculture. Many will be familiar with the term nomads, that is, people that were often on the move. They gathered their food through 3 methods: hunting, gathering, or herding. There was a significant transition that happened in humanity that changed the nomadic lifestyle to one of a farming lifestyle, and this transition is credited for about 10,000 years before Christ. The transition from the nomadic lifestyle took place in an area where native grasses were able to be used as the base of plant domestication in what was called at the time the Near East. This transition was encouraged or developed by the retreat of the last ice age, which occurred around 10,000 BCE. Native plant species were transformed into useful grains. Examples of these are barley, oats, and wheats, products we still use today. This process occurred by what we now describe as plant selection. Early farmers would select the plants that they had grown well in their climate and regions, and they would pick plants that had attributes such as good grain size or texture, or qualities that enabled them to be desirable for food preparation methods that we used at the time. As the food supply became more reliable, nomadic people settled into early villages. These were placed in modern Turkey. This occurred in about 8000 BCE. Early agriculture domesticated nuts, fruits, and pulses. By the 3rd and 4th millennium, early textbooks record rural communities. In these texts you will find that these communities consisted of a mix of farmers, and labourers. Many of these were slaves, as well as that of landowners. It is governance that enabled this situation. It is the development of agriculture which first brought around slavery. The governments needed to force a mass of people to work and manage the agricultural systems, particularly the water systems. This was about 3,150 years before Christ. It was the availability of appropriate natural resources which played a critical role in the next stage of agricultural development. The most early and significant resources are those of the two rivers, the Nile in Egypt and the rivers Tigris and Euphrates rivers of Mesopotamia. These rivers not only supply water for irrigation, but in the muddy mix that consists of the river water, there are valuable nutrient solutions. These nutrient solutions replenish the land each time plants are grown and irrigated. Although you should note that this knowledge or information was not realized at the time. The situation was unprecedented. Yields and food production was for the first time reliable. And critically, for the next stage of development, there was a surplus of food never seen in humanity before. Food production exceeding the local population requirements facilitated the development of complex societies. These changes brought with it social differentiation in about 2000 BCE. This is the first example in the global history of mankind of social differentiation, and its interconnectedness with food is seen in many examples. Another consequences of these changes in society was unfortunately the subordination of women. This is unfortunate and ironic due to the considerable role that women had played as both gatherers, and they were instrumental in plant domestication. Moving away from Athens now, we can look in some detail about China. It is interesting to compare China because China has a similar history, at least in some aspects of its food production, to that of ancient Greece and Rome. It had issues of reliability of food production. Small peasant farmers owned the land. The land was then lost to wealthy landlords, which led to issues of reliability of the food supply. Other impacting problems, like Athens, was that the population growth would often exceed that of the food supply capacities. Environmental conditions throughout China's farming history have presented many issues. These, in summary, include natural catastrophes, impoverishment of masses of farmers, abuse of wealthy landlords and government officials. The situation provoked 2 government overthrows during the Han Dynasty. Natural disasters were in part due to the fact that China is part of the monsoon Asia. Its rainfall usually occurs during the summer to early fall when the ocean winds blow into the land. This results in a mass movement of climate cycles. It is impacted by both El Nino and El Niño. During an El Nino, that is a warm eastern Pacific monsoon rains, these result in reduced rains, or they fail completely. Thus, the country goes into drought. During an El Niño movement, cooling in the eastern Pacific, this causes heavy prolonged monsoons and floodings. China has been impacted by such a degree that records show over the last 2,100 year history of Imperial China, that is from 2000 BC to 1911, there have been 1,800 disasters recorded. That means almost every single year of food production, China has either been impacted by a flood or a drought. And consequences of these are issues like infestation of disease or outbreak of disease somewhere in China. Often, the Chinese government, throughout its history, have not had the capabilities to deal with these problems. Unlike, to some extent, Greece and Rome, early farming methods in China compounded the issues of natural disasters. These have included the removal of large areas of forest leading to mass deforestation. This resulted in the loss of topsoil along with the associated nutrients. The governments during this era was poor, and dikes were ordered to be built. However, the building of these dikes often resulted in direct increases or movement of groundwater. The groundwater table would rise, resulting in further problems for plant growth. Poor river management was often seen, leading to both loss of crop and, tragically, loss of life. The Chinese, in their early literature, record many instances of how they were fearful of famine and fearful of peasants fleeing farming to engage what at the time is described as unproductive activities like trade. They were also keen to improve their food production situation, and that is, make it more reliable. The Chinese impressively constructed one of the first examples of early irrigation systems. In 250 BC, during the governance of Li Ping, they constructed an irrigation system, a levee and channels allowing water to crops off the Min River. The Min River is located in central Chinese province of Sichuan. They did this to improve river management, with the aim of eliminating flooding. The infrastructure project took 10 years to construct, and to its credit and design is still operational today. Another significant time in humanity and farming was that around the 7th century through to about the 4th century. In the following 3 slides, I'm going to use Athens as an example, detailing both historical changes in food production, but also importantly some of the drivers for this food production. Before the 7th century, around Athens, clans owned their lands collectively, and individual members could not sell their land. It was a kind of modern-day corporate. Farmers used to use themselves or their families as collateral, as they were not able to sell their own land. If the farmer had a small amount of land and could not be productive, these families would often firstly end up as tenants of the more wealthier or larger farms. During this transition, to pay off their debt, many of the poorer farmers or tenants would end up giving their assets to the wealthier farmers. If any incurred a great debt, the poor farmer and their family would then end up as slaves, and this was sought in a point of law. Poor land quality issues resulted due to extensive land clearance by removing trees. This in turn led to soil erosion issues and resulted in the decline of crop productivity. At the same time during this era, there was a change from cattle production to that of grain production. That change was a response to the increasing need for more food. The people of Athens needed more food as their population was significantly increasing. Unfortunately, at this time, Athens was often short of food. This resulted in economic and social crisis, which reached a peak about 600 BCE. Many Athens people were having significant debt, were sold or enslaved. During the end of the 5th and the early 4th centuries, several wars broke out which involved Athens. This impacted significantly on food production and farming. Food at this time was scarce. The reasons that food production were impacted were severalfold. Firstly, many of the men of the small farmers had gone off to war and either lost their life or were handicapped and could not return to farming. The ownership of the land changed again from the small farmers to the rich and the townspeople. The rich townspeople and rich farmers acquired land and then farmed this land using slaves and/or the tenant system. During the 4th century, there were periodic food shortages in Athens. There was limited technology and knowledge that resulted in low yields. Athens at this time was dependent on imports. It wasn't able to sustain its own food production. There was great concerns about the import market, and as a result, governments at the time had implemented strict regulation of profits of traders, of the millers, and of the bakers. This was seen as such a concerning issue at the time that the punishment for interfering with grain imports was death, a penalty that reflected the magnitude of the situation. The next era I want to talk about is the 19th century. The 19th century was the beginning of industrialization. During this period, there were radical and unprecedented changes to farming. They were changes to both the preparation of food and even the fundamental nature of food. During this period, transport was enabled on a countrywide and global scale, like never seen before. This included transport from Western Europe, North America, Africa, Asia, Australia, and Latin America. Perishables, such as fruit, could be transported by both train and ships in a timely manner. This opened up global markets to a volume never seen before. Some countries with the technology and the great expansion, and some countries with a lot of technology enabled great expansion of their food production industries. This era was very much enabled by advances in humanities and the ability to make and control energy. Energy production was now possible on a very large scale, and it was reliable. The ability to harness energy and invent new machinery saw a significant reduction in the amount of manual labour required for food production. This is a trend that is still continuing today. At this time, there was a great expansion into the industry of food technology and food preparation, as well as taking processing from a home kitchen into factories. Again, another significant change. There were other inventions as well that categorized this era. For example, the slaughterhouse. This significantly changed meat production, both in the scales and the ability to carve meat. The industries such as bread, beer and wine production were enabled on much larger scales than ever seen previously. This era invented tin food, another significant change to food processing. Not only did this change food production technologies, farming, but it also changed social convenience. The frozen food industry also took hold along this era due to reliable energy. This was enabled both in storage, production, and transport from a commercial context, but also storage in the home. The production of food in this new way allowed and enabled urbanization. Urbanization continued to become an important food driver into modern day times. While this period resulted in great growth for farmers, it resulted in other changes that were not so favourable for the industry. it started the future market systems, a gamble, which could leave farmers at the mercy of new profiteers and speculators. As the consumer no longer had direct access to food, this really did change attitudes. Wholesalers were able to take components of the profits, and as time has gone on, the share of the profits have increased. This period transformed the economic of farming, both in a positive and in a negative way, and it all depends on your perspective and where you sit in the process. This era saw the change of gender roles, as women abandoned their domestic duties, as seen at the time, and entered the industry workplace. This era had its share of politics that influenced food production. In general, monarchy governance was changed to national status. This era was the development of the middle class, and how middle class were enabled the change in politics. Sections of society, that is the middle class sections, grew at an unprecedented rate. Before this, it had largely been a small rich and a very large number of poor people. The large majority status of middle class is still seen in many societies today. During this period, the French Revolution, which occurred in 1789, created the first national cuisine. There were cookbooks and information on recipes and food in a way that had never seen before. New restaurants were opening up all over the place, and the French really did set the way in new standards of preparing, presenting, and just generally appreciating food that hadn't really been seen before. The downside of the French setting the way to some extent was the consequence of promoting yet further social status divide. The fine dining and associated experiences, expensive restaurants, allowed differentiation in society. Therefore, as you can see, this era not only changed the markets of food production, but it changed the lifestyles of many families. These changes have significant social changes and continue to modern-day farming practices. The last era I am going to cover brings us approximately up to date, the 20th and a little bit of the 21st century. These eras are one of continued advancement in food production from that of the 19th century. The 19th century set up many technological advances, and these enabled globalization, but it was really the 20th century that embedded or embraced globalization in a way it had never been seen before. There were massive advances in knowledge. This was both in research, information sharing, education, and production understandings. You can think of the 20th and the 21st eras as never seen before production efficiencies, and these were enabled not only by the new knowledge, but by products like synthetic fertilizers and improved technology to deliver water and then to make an optimal irrigation decision. Significant and unprecedented yields in crops and animals were impacted in every sector of food production during these centuries. Reduced waste was also seen due to technological advances both at the farm gate and post to the farm gate. There was increased reliability in food production in this era. People began to rely on the food production being stable and constant and non-seasonal. There were periods of disruption to food productions during these eras. Predominantly the First and the Second World Wars had massive impacts during these periods. Politics and governance, as they have done in the past, continue to influence food production, particularly in the legal sector. This era brought about changes in consumer attitudes, again like never witnessed before. The introduction of the concept of ethical considerations surrounding many food production sectors creeped into the consumer's consciousness. The concept that the environment was possibly more than just land to be used by humanity, but should be thought of as an asset, also changed consumer choices and preferences. This trend has continued well into the 21st century, with new industries in the production area being produced, able to meet the concerns, the ethics and the morals of these particular consumers. This is also a time when disruption to small farms seemed to occur in many areas across the world. The small farms reduced in number and were replaced by larger agro-businesses. The introduction of technology like genetically modified organisms and the ability to accurately measure inputs and your outputs of many of your production processes has enabled significant increases in every stage of production, again from the farm all the way through to the supermarket shelf. So to summarise, these eras were really the eras of increased efficiency in every component and sector of the food production industry, and these changes enabled globalisation. It is both globalisation and the commercialisation, along with the ever-pressing issue of population numbers, that are today driving production in these eras. In this next section of the lecture, we are going to explore the topic from the perspective of the factors that drove agricultural production throughout humanity. You will of course appreciate that this history is long, detailed and varied, and therefore in this lecture we will only look at a snapshot. The world population, by many experts, is seen as the most significant food production driver, not only in early humanity, but in modern-day humanity. The world population is defined as the total number of living humans on the earth at any one time. As of 2013, this was estimated to be a staggering 7.17 billion by the United States Census Bureau. The world population has experienced continuous growth, but there have been periods that have slowed this growth down, such as the Great Famine and the Black Death in 1350. At this time, in 1350, the world population was about 370 million. There have been significant eras of growth across humanity. The most noteworthy are from the 1800s and upwards. The population during the 1800s was about 1,000 million. There have been periods where the population growth rate has been staggering. For example, it was 1.8% per year in the 1950s, which then went up and up to a staggering 2.2% in 1963. It has declined slightly by 2012, where it dropped to 1.1%. Population growth is of course a balance between annual births and death rate that year. The population is estimated by 2050 to be somewhere between 8.3 and 10.9 billion people. This suggests that global population is going to continue in the future to be a significant driver of food production. On some levels, the relationship between large populations and food production is an obvious one. That is, if you have a large global population, a lot of people, you have to feed them, and therefore your food production has to match this. It becomes more complicated, however, when you consider the other inputs that govern population. That is, food supply relies on productive land availability, efficient fertilizers, good quality water. Food production for a large population is very dependent in modern times on economics, and this complicates the relationships. That is, how a wealthy country deals with shortages of food is quite different to how a country without wealth may be able to deal with this situation. There is great inequity in this problem. It has been noted by many scientists that production efficiencies are unlikely to be significant. And what do we mean by this? Well, our ability to grow, say, wheat at a certain tonnage over a certain area of land is probably close to optimal at this point. Therefore, any new changes in varieties and technologies, while they may improve productivity, will not have the stepwise production efficiencies increases that we've seen in the past. Therefore, we probably cannot rely on production efficiencies to increase agricultural output on a global scale significantly. And all of these issues are impacted further by the impacts of climate change and the complicated relationships of global population, food production, and changing weather systems. Another significant contribution to farming driving factors, and perhaps an obvious one, is that of starvation and malnutrition. This driver is the wanting to avoid the situation. Malnutrition has led to epidemic diseases, social change, changes in governance, and a wish for governance to avoid these situations. And there are many, many examples that line the history books of humanity. This driving factor accompanied man from early times and is still a driving factor to today's. Food shortages developed during the World War I, and they were actually used as a conscious weapon. The shortages are hypothesized to have started just before the war in the 1900s, and they were a consequence of what we call the law of diminishing returns. Perhaps a less recognized food production driver is that of social fractions, which has been driven by food production. What I mean by this is that the production of agriculture and how it has occurred has resulted in hierarchies in humanity and has differentiated people. This started as early in humanity as the post-classical period. Again, literature is scattered with many examples. One example stated here is that of both Chinese and Rome. Both of these cultures developed sophisticated agriculture and considered the preparation of food as a mark of their civilized status. The process of their food production also resulted in hierarchies. That is, farmers were made tenants and slaves, while landowners were considered very high in the civilization status. This also resulted in the diets of these various people. Landowners tended to eat good diets, varied diets, while slaves and farmers and tenants tended to eat less sophisticated diets and were always at risk of hunger. The first sight of what is called first-class cuisine is credited during the banquets of Baghdad. The influence of governance over the farming has been a big one throughout humanity. I have given some examples of early governance in the first part of this lecture, which you can match here. The history books are littered with many more examples, and only a couple have been presented in this lecture. There are examples of how governance has had a positive influence on agriculture and a negative consequence. It is without doubt that governance is still significantly influencing farming. The issue of resources and the role of politics I see as a continuing conflict and debate. Perhaps one of the most modern examples of this, of governance, is cited in Australia, where water rules have recently been changed. Federal governments manage how much water a farmer can have, where the water will be delivered, and the volume of water. This has impacted significantly on the management of water, and some water has been taken away from farming and put into environments. There are many modern laws governing farming inputs, such as the use of chemicals, and there are also a suite of laws which govern food handling. These we refer to as the Safe Food Handling Laws, and if you refer to the Food Legal website, you can see many examples of such laws that are used in Australia. Religion is perhaps another obvious food production driver. There are many examples throughout humanity of how religion has evolved and developed with our ability to farm. One such example is that of Chinese cuisine during the Western Zhou dynasty, which occurred about 1040 to 771 BCE. The governance of this time asserted its role and legitimacy for being in governance, as it said that there was a mandate from heaven. That is, that they were able to rule because it was the will of the millet god. Ethical and moral concerns over the lifespan of humanity have also been a food production driver. The examples here are extremely varied. For example, Islamic dietary laws impose some restrictions on what people can and can't eat. For example, pork was forbidden to Muslims, making mutton the desired meat in the Muslim world. However, there are other examples of where farming methods have changed considerably due to ethical and moral concerns that consumers may have. Conventional farming is characterized by monocropping, green revolution technologies, and synthetic fertilizer use. There have been a suite of modern alternative farming methods which have been explored due to ethical and moral concerns of consumerism. Without going into detail here, the Organic Foods Production Act, the OFPA, which was formed in the US in 1990 under Title 21, established uniform national standards for the production and handling of foods labelled as organic. This act authorised a new USDA National Organic Programme to set national standards for the production, handling and processing of organically grown agricultural products. In addition, the programme oversees mandatory certification of organic production. This is the beginning of organic farming, and it has spread wide since this time. Many countries now have organic farms, and many consumers use this as a preference. The main driver for organic farming is from an economic consideration. That is, you tend to produce less food, but of what is perceived by consumers as a higher quality. Therefore, they pay a higher price for their ethical and moral concerns to be considered. There are other alternative farming methods such as permaculture, indigenous farming, and agroecology. You may not have heard of agroecology before, but this is a farming approach that mimics natural ecosystems. It's an alternative to the conventional method, and it can produce more food using fewer resources. It does require a high-level understanding of your environment, climate. I would like you to read the following article from The Guardian, which talks about extensively agroecology, permaculture and indigenous farming. Please add this article to your notes. Another modern-day consideration for farming practices have been animal welfare. Only a couple of years ago in Australia did this make national news with the export of cattle to some countries. Commercialism is a food production driver. It is considered more as a modern food production driver, but history does show many examples throughout humanity of how commercialism has influenced food production methodologies and other elements affecting farming. In a modern day context, it influences every factor of farming practices. It can also influence a farmer's social status, both in a negative scenario and in a positive one. It can influence the amount of money which is directed towards research and knowledge, and indeed the direction of that research and knowledge. So therefore, it is a fair statement to say that commercialism is probably the most significant food production driver, and it underpins modern agriculture. How we will deal with commercialism and food productions in the future is an interesting question. There are some concerns about global resources, such as nutrients. How will this be influenced by the wealthy who have a lot of power over the process of commercialism? There are issues of equity across the global populations and food production, and also, as ever, the involvement of politics. It is an interesting question to ask, will commercialism be as influential into future farming as it is on modern day? Or perhaps politics and governance may become more influential. Another production driver is the environment, or environmental. This brings together location, enterprise, and climate. It is worth noting that these are very enterprise-specific, location-specific, and climate-specific. That is, the impact of, say, wheat grown in Australia may be quite different to the impact of wheat grown in Europe. Therefore, this production driver can be thought as very variable, enterprise-specific, and is massively different depending on where you're located in the world. If we for a moment stop and think about the future and the predicted climate changes, the influences of this particular food production driver could be quite large. It is not that climate hasn't been variable in the past. It is that global climate change predictions suggest that climate variabilities will be more increased. Farming suffers greatly from variability. Resources is rather a large topic and does cover many influences on food production. The most obvious statement is that it is very specific to any one enterprise. A list of potential resources that you can consider influential are nutrients or fertilizers, adequate water and the right purity of water, adequate carbon dioxide levels, adequate light, sufficient land, farm infrastructure, which is also covered in another food production driver. The farm infrastructure I relate to here is on more a farm by farm or local scale. And a knowledge, that is the ability to be able to farm to the best of both the inputs and the resources available. There are some recent examples of how knowledge and infrastructure have helped sufficiently in some industries. For example, the Australian rice industry has significantly increased its water use efficiencies. This has only occurred in the last couple of years and was a consequence of extreme environments for the rice industry. In fact, there were a few years where it was illegal to grow rice in Australia due to governance and a lack of water resource. Industry and transport infrastructure are another food production driver. By industry infrastructure, what we refer to here is any infrastructure that is required outside the farm gate. This may include businesses that store grain, supply equipment to transport capabilities, businesses that allow you to hire harvesters, for example. Transport includes any mode of transport, regardless of whether it's mechanical or not, so that can range from a horse to a truck. Another important development in this area was the use of refrigeration. Both the use of refrigeration in transport, such as in trucks and shipping containers, which significantly increases the shelf life of many perishables, but also that of long-term storage. Long-term storage facilitates the market to sell perishables at times of the year when they're not typically grown. This theoretically allows the producer to get a good price for the produce. Finally, the last example of infrastructure I'd like to place is the humble shopping trolley. Something you may not normally consider as an important component to a food production driver, but actually it has a significant role, as it played a great step in the advancement of supermarkets. You see, before the shopping trolley, the concept of being able to buy a large amount of shopping in one go was not viewed upon popularly, because people just couldn't carry the produce out. With the design of the shopping trolley, people could fill up 1 or 2 weeks or a month's worth of groceries with ease, and thus the shopping trolley is accredited to some extent for the great success of supermarkets. The FAO defined food security in 3 different sectors. There's absolute availability, the money that you have to buy food, and healthy food production. Food security and all 3 of these associated components have all been food production drivers throughout history and are indeed still food production drivers today. An example of a modern day problem was the outbreak of mad cow disease. This occurred in Brazil, for example, and Australian imports were able to increase because our cow were free of this disease, and therefore the meat was regarded as safe. A classical definition of food security, of course, is the existence of pests and diseases on the agricultural livestock and your crop production. There are many examples of how pests and disease have reduced food production. This looks likely to be an issue to continue into the future. An interesting and perhaps new food production is that of the healthy industry. This is where you grow food for health. This can define many things, from pharmaceuticals through to the more commonly known gluten-free foods. The food for health industry usually requires a large amount of regulation and high skill in order to produce the food. A final category that you could place under food security, but also define under other categories like ethics and morals, is that of diet choices. Whether you are a vegetarian or whether you only eat a high protein diet, for example. These are all food production drivers. The last food production driver that I wish to mention in this lecture is that of globalization. Globalization has many components to it, but largely depends on the knowledge of products. That is, if you live in China, you know what's grown in Australia, and if you live in Australia, you know what food products may be available in China. Once you know of their existence, you may then wish to demand them, and this is where consumer preference and choice have been very influential in globalization. Globalization will start with knowledge, and then the next step is economics. That is, for the ability for a consumer to change the economics so that it is worthwhile for that produce to be delivered to them. Transport and international markets are very important components of globalization. You can see some of these examples of food production drivers sit across several categories. I would also like to note that this is by no means an exclusive list of food production drivers, and I'm sure in your journey through this subject and your research you will come across many more. Bringing us up to modern day farming, it is now acknowledged that famine is rare. Of course, there are still some exceptions in the world to this, such as the country Ethiopia, where it is common. It should be noted that even in modern day times, food shortages still arise, and they result in a per capita income and expectations, as stated by Kilman in 1987. Kilman also stated that there is no uniforming hypothesis that satisfactorily describes the man-food production dilemma, that is, population growth and food production. I think this reflects how complicated food production and changes in humanity have been. There have been models produced which examine the relationship of causation, the role of technology, automation of population food resources, and responses and constraints of food production. It should be noted that some of these models work well for some times and some period through humanity, but at other periods do not work. I'd like you at the end of this lecture to please find the HTTP website link and watch the 7-minute video As We Sow. This is a short documentary about the demise, or displacement and disappearance, of family farms in the state of Iowa in the US. It makes comparisons of family farming to that of large corporate farming enterprises, impacts on productivity and employment, and how this impacts on local communities. It seems a change to modern food production, and drivers in food production have seated around where the food is produced. There are many consumers in modern day retail that feel it is important that the location of the food production is a driver for whether a consumer will purchase this food or not. In the conversation, there is an essential reading by Rose 2004 called Let's Reap the Economic Benefits of Local Food Over Big Farming. Again, this presents interesting arguments of both the location of the food and the scale of farming. Please read this article by following the link and make relevant notes and insert into your lecture here. The Food Alliance is an organisation that details information about local food production for the Melbourne's urban fringe. They've produced the following map. This map gives details of what food is grown or produced in what areas. There is often a requirement for local consumers that the food not travel a long distance. This can either be a direct requirement from an environmental perspective, or it can be an indirect requirement in that the consumer wishes to see that their food is fresh. Food production in Melbourne's urban fringe is worth about 1.3 to 1.6 billion, and it generates about 6,000 jobs. Around 40 to 50% of Victoria's total vegetable production, for example, is produced in Melbourne's fringe, that is, within 100 kilometres of the city. Therefore, the Melbourne fringe production is an important source of fresh local produce. This data was sourced from the Australian Bureau of Statistics Agricultural Commodities Australia in the years 2010 to 2011. These underpin some of the food production requirements and food production drivers for Melbourne. And that brings us briefly to the future of food production. I am not going to spend a lot of time on the future of food production, as not only is that covered in other courses in this degree, but it is complex. The following documentary, the Future of Food documentary, gives a snippet on the genetic engineering foods and how trends in corporate food production are perhaps driving changes to what foods we grow and eat. Please review this video and make notes. Make these notes in the context of the elements that drive food production. This brings us towards the end of this lecture. So in summary, what have we learnt about the evolution of food production? In the lecture we have covered some aspects. However, the amount of knowledge required to understand all food production drivers and all components of food and humanity is extensive and too large a topic to cover in detail here. What we have been able to cover is snapshots, indicators of how certain changes and certain drivers of change were in fact shown in history. In summary, we have seen that advances in food production are tightly integrated with humanity. This has enabled significant changes in human lifestyles, in civilizations, in health, and indeed wealth and power of people. The drivers of food production are multiple and often complex, and they are often dynamic. That is, there can be a certain number of factors at one moment in time, but in another moment of time there'll be another combination of factors. Some will be common, some will be different. Therefore, commonalities through time for some food production drivers, such as the ability to govern, population growth, good old politics, land degradation and economics, certainly have been a repeated pattern throughout history. Modern production drivers have been significantly influenced by globalization and commercialization, and this has been enabled largely by technology and widespread knowledge. Here is a list of the references that have been cited in the production of this lecture. This is the end of the lecture on food, the evolution of food production.